The first thing Lieutenant Commander Vega Reyes noticed wasn't the lock-on tone screaming through her headset, or the twin F-18 Super Hornets materializing off her starboard wing like metallic angels of death. It was the silence that came after. That brief, crystalline moment when even the Pacific Ocean seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to make the wrong move. Her modified A-10C Thunderbolt II banked hard left, the titanium bathtub protecting her from everything except the growing certainty that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The IFF transponder should have been broadcasting friendly codes, should have been telling every radar system within 200 miles that she was coming home, not hunting. Unidentified aircraft bearing 270, this is Falcon 11. The lead pilot's voice crackled through her radio, professional but tight with barely controlled aggression. You are flying in restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately or we will engage. Vega's hands moved across her instrument panel with practiced precision, muscle memory taking over where her racing mind faltered. The transponder showed green. Everything showed green. Yet somehow, impossibly, she had become a ghost in her own sky. Falcon 11, this is Raven 67, call sign Tombstone, she transmitted, using the handle that had followed her through 3 deployments and more close calls than she cared to count. I'm RTB from Training Mission Romeo 7 Alpha. Check your scopes, boys. I'm one of the good guys. The pause stretched longer than her fuel reserves would allow. Through her canopy, she could see the lead Hornet's pilot turning his helmet toward her, the dark visor reflecting nothing but sky and questions. Behind him, his wingman had drifted into perfect firing position, 20mm cannon probably already spinning up to speed. Negative, Tombstone, came the reply, and something in the pilot's tone made Vega's blood run cold. Your aircraft is squawking a code that's been dead for 15 years. According to our system, you don't exist. The words hit her like flak bursts, each syllable a small explosion in her chest. Dead for 15 years. She knew that code, knew it the way a person knows their own heartbeat. It belonged to someone who had died in the mountains of Afghanistan, someone whose warthog had been shot down by a surface-to-air missile while providing close air support to a trapped Marine unit. Someone whose death had been classified, buried so deep that even mentioning the mission required clearance she didn't have. The code belonged to her father. Now she was broadcasting it from 30,000 feet above the Pacific, in an aircraft that shouldn't exist, carrying ordnance that wasn't supposed to be loaded, on a mission that had never been officially authorized. The F-18s weren't the real problem. The real problem was that someone, somewhere, was playing games with ghosts. The radio crackled again. Tombstone, You have 60 seconds to explain how a dead man's transponder code is flying around in restricted airspace, or we're going to have a very short conversation about national security. 60 seconds to explain 15 years of lies, cover-ups, and a father she had never really known. 60 seconds to convince two very nervous pilots that she wasn't the enemy, when she wasn't entirely sure herself. The Pacific stretched endlessly below them, dark blue fading to black at the horizon. Somewhere down there, her father's aircraft was still settling into the ocean floor, carrying secrets that weren't supposed to surface. But here she was, broadcasting his ghost across the sky like a beacon. "Falcon flight, stand by," she transmitted, buying time she didn't have while her mind raced through possibilities. The code wasn't random. Someone had programmed it into her system, someone with access to classified frequencies and the clearance to know which dead pilots were worth remembering. The question wasn't how her father's code had found its way into her aircraft. The question was who wanted her to broadcast it, and why they had waited 15 years to send their message. Through her headset, she could hear the lead pilot breathing, steady and controlled, the sound of a professional making calculations about threat assessment and rules of engagement. His wingman was climbing slightly, gaining altitude advantage, preparing for the engagement that seemed increasingly inevitable. Vega rolled her warthog into a gentle descent, the movement casual enough to avoid triggering any aggressive responses, but purposeful enough to demonstrate that she wasn't planning to run. Running would only confirm their suspicions, and besides, there was nowhere to go that an F-18 couldn't follow. The truth was somewhere in the ghost code, in the 15-year-old signal that had somehow found its way from a classified grave to her instrument panel. But truth was a luxury she couldn't afford with two Super Hornets breathing down her neck, and a fuel gauge that was starting to look uncomfortably optimistic about her chances of making it home. "Tombstone," the radio crackled again. 30 seconds. And before you think about running, be advised that we have additional assets inbound. This conversation is going to happen one way or another. Additional assets. That could mean anything from more interceptors to a flight of F-22 Raptors that she would never see coming. The Pacific had suddenly become a very crowded and very dangerous place. She keyed her microphone, knowing that whatever she said next would either diffuse the situation or guarantee that her next conversation would be with whoever investigated shoot-downs of friendly aircraft. The weight of her father's ghost code pressed against her chest like body armor, heavy with the accumulated mass of 15 years' worth of unanswered questions. "Falcon 1-1, I'm going to transmit a different code," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "Check the authentication against Black Widow archives, classification level Tango 77, And gentlemen, when you see what comes up on your screens, you're going to wish you'd never heard of Tombstone. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the silence of confusion or tactical positioning. This was the silence of pilots who had just realized they were flying into something much larger and much more dangerous than a simple airspace violation. Vega's fingers found the secondary transponder control, the one hidden beneath a locked panel that wasn't supposed to exist on A-10s. The panel that had been installed by technicians who didn't officially work for any branch of the military, in a hangar that didn't appear on any base blueprints. She flipped the switch, and somewhere in the electronic spectrum, her aircraft began broadcasting a different kind of ghost entirely. The lead F-18 pilot's sharp intake of breath was audible over the radio before he cut his transmission, but not before she heard the beginning of what sounded like a very creative and very unprintable assessment of the situation. His wingman had gone completely silent, which was somehow worse than cursing. "Jesus Christ, Tombstone," the lead pilot finally managed, his voice stripped of all professional composure. "Where the hell did you get that code? And please tell me you know what you're doing." The new code was working its way through military computer systems, triggering authentication protocols that hadn't been used since the War on Terror was still front-page news. Deep in the Pentagon's digital archives, files were opening that had been sealed by executive order, their contents disseminating through secure channels to very surprised intelligence analysts. "Falcon 1-1, I wish I could tell you," Vega replied, watching her fuel gauge with the detached interest of someone who had accepted that normal rules no longer applied to her situation. "But the truth is, I found out about this code about 3 minutes before you did. And I have the uncomfortable feeling that someone wanted it that way." The F-18s had backed off slightly, no longer in attack position, but still close enough to engage if she made any sudden moves. Their pilots were probably receiving urgent communications from ground controllers who were trying to figure out how a supposedly routine training flight had suddenly involved classified programs that officially didn't exist. Below them, the Pacific continued its ancient rhythm of waves and wind, indifferent to the small drama of human secrets playing out at 30,000 feet. But Vega knew that indifference was an illusion. The ocean kept its own secrets, and some of them had been sleeping on the bottom for 15 years, waiting for the right signal to wake them up. "Tombstone, this is Falcon 1-1, the radio crackled, the pilot's voice now carrying a different kind of tension. "We're being directed to escort you to alternate landing site. Do not acknowledge on this frequency. Switch to secure channel 77 Alpha and await further instructions." Alternate landing site meant somewhere that wasn't on any civilian aviation charts, somewhere designed for aircraft carrying cargo or passengers that couldn't be processed through normal channels. It meant that her ghost code had triggered protocols that transformed a simple training flight into something that required security clearances and non-disclosure agreements. She switched frequencies and immediately heard a new voice, crisp and authoritative, with the kind of precise diction that suggested either intelligence services or very expensive private education. Possibly both. Tombstone, this is control. Be advised that your current situation has been elevated to national security priority. You will maintain current heading and altitude until further notice. Any deviation from assigned flight path will be considered hostile action. National security priority. The phrase carried weight that settled into her stomach like a lead breakfast, heavy and indigestible. Whatever game was being played with her father's ghost code had just escalated beyond military channels and into the realm of people who made decisions that never appeared in official records. Through her canopy, she could see the lead F-18 pilot watching her, his helmet turned in her direction like a predator tracking prey. But there was something else in his posture now, a tension that suggested he was as much a prisoner of the situation as she was. The ghost code had trapped them all in a conspiracy that none of them had chosen to join. The radio remained silent as they flew north toward whatever alternate landing site had been selected for aircraft carrying 15-year-old secrets. Behind them, the Pacific stretched away toward the horizon, keeping its own counsel about what lay beneath its surface. Vega checked her instruments again, noting the steady burn of fuel that would leave her with minimal reserves by the time they reached their destination. Someone had planned this carefully, timing the ghost code's activation to ensure that she would have no choice but to land wherever they directed her. The question that echoed through her mind, keeping rhythm with the turbofan engines, was whether her father had been part of the plan or simply another piece in a game that was much larger than either of them had ever imagined. "Control, this is Tombstone," she transmitted, decision crystallizing in her voice. "Before we proceed further, I need to know something. The pilot whose code I was broadcasting, did he really die in Afghanistan?" The silence stretched long enough for her to wonder if she had just asked the wrong question to very dangerous people. When Control finally responded, the voice was carefully neutral, stripped of any emotional content that might provide clues about the speaker's real intentions. "Tombstone, that information is classified above your current clearance level. Maintain current heading." But in the pause before those words, in the space between question and answer, Vega heard something that made her blood run cold. She heard the sound of someone choosing their words very carefully, the verbal equivalent of walking through a minefield. Her father's death wasn't just classified, it was complicated. The F-18s maintained their escort positions as they flew north, their pilots professional and alert, but Vega could sense the change in their demeanor. They weren't just shepherding a wayward pilot anymore. They were part of something that involved ghost codes and classified programs and questions that couldn't be answered over open radio channels. Her aircraft's instruments showed everything normal: engine temperatures, hydraulic pressure, weapons status all green. But normal was an illusion when you were broadcasting codes that belonged to dead pilots and flying toward destinations that didn't appear on any official flight plans. Through the headset, she could hear the subtle background chatter of military communications, controllers and pilots maintaining the constant flow of information that kept aircraft safely separated in increasingly crowded skies. But underneath that familiar rhythm was something else, a tension that suggested multiple agencies were suddenly paying very close attention to one modified and its cargo of 15-year-old secrets. Tombstone, this is Falcon 1-1. The lead pilot's voice cut through the background noise, casual but with an undertone that suggested he was choosing his words as carefully as Control had. "How's your fuel looking? We may have a longer flight than originally planned." Longer flight meant more time to think, more time for the ghost code to work its way through whatever systems it was designed to access. More time for people in windowless rooms to make decisions about what to do with pilots who asked inconvenient questions about classified operations. Falcon 1-1, fuel is adequate for extended operations, she replied, the standard military euphemism that could mean anything from plenty of gas to running on fumes and prayers. In her case, it was closer to the latter, but admitting fuel concerns would only complicate an already complex situation. The Pacific below had given way to the California coastline, the familiar geography of home now looking strange and somehow threatening. Somewhere down there were people living normal lives, worrying about normal problems, completely unaware that overhead, their government was playing games with ghost codes and dead pilot secrets. Her radio crackled with a new transmission, this one using call signs she didn't recognize and procedures that weren't in any manual she had ever seen. The language was standard military communications, but the underlying protocols belonged to something else entirely, something that operated in the spaces between official organizations. All stations, be advised that package November is inbound to reception Alpha. ETA 15 minutes. Security teams are authorized and standing by. Package November. That was her, reduced to a military designation that could mean cargo, personnel, or something that required special handling. Reception Alpha would be the alternate landing site, wherever that turned out to be. The F-18s began a gradual descent, leading her down toward an altitude where the air was thicker, and her engines would burn fuel more efficiently. But efficiency was a relative concept when every mile north took her further from any airfield she knew, deeper into a situation that had already moved beyond her ability to control. Through her canopy, she could see the lead pilot's aircraft clearly now, the sleek lines of the Super Hornet designed for speed and lethality. His weapons were still safe, but she knew that could change in seconds if someone decided. She represented a threat that couldn't be managed through normal channels. The thought occurred to her that she might not survive the landing, that whatever secrets were buried with her father might require another burial to keep them safe. It wasn't a paranoid thought. It was a realistic assessment of how governments dealt with inconvenient truths that couldn't be explained to congressional oversight committees. Falcon Flight, contact approach on frequency 254.75, the radio announced. Another step in the process of transferring her from one set of handlers to another. Each frequency change took her deeper into the classified world, further from any hope of simply explaining that she had been flying a routine training mission when everything went sideways. She switched frequencies and immediately heard a new voice, this one belonging to someone who sounded like they made a living out of managing situations that officially didn't exist. The tone was calm, professional, and completely devoid of the courtesy that usually characterized controller-pilot communications. Package November, this is reception control. Runway 27 is cleared for your arrival. Wind is light and variable. Be advised that all communications are being recorded and monitored for security purposes. The warning about recorded communication was standard procedure for classified facilities, but something about the way it was delivered suggested that the recording would serve purposes beyond normal quality control. Whatever she said from this point forward would become part of a permanent record that would be analyzed by people who specialized in finding meaning in silence as much as in speech. Below her, she could now see their destination. A runway carved out of what looked like empty desert, surrounded by buildings that were too symmetrical to be natural, but too sparse to be obviously military. It looked like the kind of place where aircraft landed but didn't necessarily take off, where questions were answered but not necessarily truthfully. Reception control. Package November has the field in sight, she transmitted, beginning the approach checklist that would bring her ghost code and her father's secrets safely to ground. Request approach and landing clearance. Package November, cleared for straighten approach runway 27. Contact ground control on 121.9 after landing. Welcome to Mercury Base. Mercury Base. The name meant nothing to her, which probably meant it was chosen specifically to mean nothing to anyone who wasn't supposed to know about it. The kind of designation that would produce blank stares from intelligence analysts who weren't cleared for whatever operations were conducted there. The approach was smooth, her A-10's heavy landing gear extending with the mechanical certainty of systems that had been designed to function under the worst possible conditions. But as she lined up with the runway, she noticed details that made her skin crawl. The unusual thickness of the concrete, the blast-resistant design of the buildings, the complete absence of any identifying markings or national symbols. This wasn't just a classified facility. This was a place where things happened that couldn't be acknowledged by any official government. Her wheels touched down with a satisfying thump, the aircraft settling onto the runway with the authority of several tons of titanium and determination. But as she rolled out, she noticed the reception committee waiting for her. Vehicles with no identifying markings, personnel in uniform that carried no indication of branch or nationality, and enough security measures to suggest that Mercury Base took its privacy very seriously. Package November, contact ground control, the radio reminded her, but her attention was focused on the figures approaching her aircraft. They moved with the easy confidence of people who were accustomed to handling sensitive situations, and they were clearly expecting her. The question was whether they were expecting her specifically, or just expecting whatever pilot happened to be broadcasting her father's ghost code. She keyed the radio for what might be the last normal transmission of her military career. Ground control. Package November is clear of the active runway and requesting taxi instructions. Package November. Taxi to parking spot Alpha 7. Shut down engines and remain in your aircraft until cleared by security personnel. Do not attempt to communicate with anyone outside official channels. The instruction to remain in her aircraft meant they weren't taking any chances with whatever she might know or might say to the wrong people. It also meant that from the moment she shut down her engines, she would be completely dependent on other people's decisions about what happened next. As she taxied toward the designated parking spot, she could see more details of Mercury Base. Aircraft that didn't appear in any official inventory, buildings that could withstand significant external pressure, and personnel who moved with the easy alertness of people who had seen things that weren't supposed to be seen. Her father's ghost code had brought her home, but home turned out to be a place that officially didn't exist, populated by people who officially weren't there, to answer questions that officially had never been asked. The engine spun down to silence, leaving her alone in the cockpit with the weight of 15 years' worth of secrets, and the growing certainty that her normal life had just ended somewhere over the Pacific. Whatever came next would be determined by people who specialized in managing problems that couldn't be solved through normal channels. Through her canopy, she could see the security team approaching, their movements professional but not threatening. Yet, They looked like people who were accustomed to dealing with pilots who had stumbled into situations beyond their clearance level, and they had probably developed efficient procedures for managing such complications. The lead figure gestured for her to shut down all systems and prepare for debriefing, the kind of hand signal that was universal among people who handled classified materials on a regular basis. Professional, courteous, and completely non-negotiable. Vega began the shutdown procedure, each switch position taking her aircraft from operational readiness to dormant metal. But even as her instruments went dark, she knew that the real operation was just beginning. Somewhere in the electronic spectrum, her father's ghost code was still working its way through classified systems, opening files that had been sealed for 15 years. The security team reached her aircraft and took positions around it, their posture suggesting readiness rather than threat. They looked like people who were prepared for multiple contingencies, but hoped that the situation could be resolved through conversation rather than more direct methods. One of them approached her cockpit and gestured for her to open the canopy. His uniform carried no visible rank or identification, but his bearing suggested someone who was accustomed to command authority. When he spoke, his voice was calm and professional, the tone of someone who dealt with sensitive situations as a matter of routine. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the aircraft and accompany us for debriefing. This is not an arrest, and you are not in any legal jeopardy at this time. We just need to sort out some questions about your flight plan and your aircraft's identification codes." "Not in legal jeopardy at this time" was a qualifier that carried significant implications about what could change depending on how the next few hours went. But his tone suggested that cooperation would be appreciated and probably reciprocated. Vega popped her canopy and began the process of extracting herself from the cockpit muscle memory, taking over the complex choreography of disconnecting life support systems and safing ejection seat mechanisms. The desert air was warm and dry, carrying scents of sage and creosote that reminded her of childhood visits to her grandmother's house in Arizona. But there was something else in the air, a tension that suggested Mercury Base was accustomed to hosting conversations about subjects that required careful handling. The kind of place where questions were answered completely and honestly, but only to people with the proper clearance and need to know. As she climbed down from her aircraft, she noticed additional details about her surroundings. The unusual sophistication of the communications arrays, the hardened construction of every building, and the complete absence of any civilian air traffic or commercial aircraft. This was a facility that existed entirely within the classified world, invisible to anyone who wasn't supposed to know about it. The security team leader extended his hand in greeting, the gesture casual but with undertones that suggested he knew more about her situation than she did. "Ma'am, I'm Agent Collins. We've been expecting you, though I admit the circumstances are somewhat unusual. If you'll come with us, we can get this situation sorted out as quickly as possible." Expecting her. That confirmed what she had suspected since the ghost code first activated. This wasn't a malfunction or coincidence. Someone had planned for her to broadcast her father's identification code. Someone had arranged for her to be intercepted by F-18s, and someone had made sure she would end up at Mercury Base for whatever came next. The question was whether she was a willing participant in someone else's plan, or simply another piece being moved around a board game that was much larger and more complex than she had ever imagined. As they walked toward the nearest building, Agent Collins maintained a casual conversation that was clearly designed to keep her calm and cooperative while extracting basic information about her background and current situation. He was skilled at the technique, asking questions that seemed innocent but were clearly designed to assess her knowledge level and potential security risks. "So, Tombstone, how long have you been flying that particular aircraft? It's not exactly standard configuration for training missions." The question about her A-10's modifications was probably the most important one he could ask, because the modifications were what had made it possible for her to broadcast her father's ghost code. Someone with very high clearance and very specific technical knowledge had arranged for her aircraft to carry capabilities that didn't appear on any official documentation. "Agent Collins, I've been flying that bird for about 8 months," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "And you're right about the configuration. There are some systems installed that I was told were part of an upgraded avionics package, but I'm starting to suspect they serve other purposes." They had reached the building, which looked like standard military construction from the outside, but had security measures that suggested much more sensitive operations inside. Biometric scanners, electromagnetic shielding, and communications equipment that belonged in intelligence facilities rather than normal military installations. Agent Collins held the door for her, the courtesy automatic but tinged with the awareness that she was now officially in federal custody, regardless of whatever pleasant euphemisms they chose to use. "Ma'am, the people who are waiting to speak with you are going to be very interested in those systems. And I think you're going to be very interested in what they have to tell you about your father." The mention of her father stopped her cold, the casual reference hitting her like a physical blow. They knew, not just about the ghost code, not just about the aircraft modifications, but about the personal connection that tied everything together. They had been planning this conversation for longer than she had been broadcasting the code. "Agent Collins," she said, her voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening in her chest. "Before we go any further, I need to know something. Is my father really dead?" The pause before his answer was long enough for her to notice the subtle changes in his expression, the careful recalibration of someone who realized they were dealing with questions that went beyond normal security briefings. When he finally responded, his voice carried a gentleness that suggested he understood the personal cost of the secrets they were about to discuss. "Ma'am, that's a conversation that's going to require a much higher clearance level than either of us currently has. But I can tell you this. The people waiting for you have been hopping for 15 years that someone would finally ask that question." They had been hopping for 15 years. That meant her father's death wasn't just classified. It was complicated in ways that had been generating paperwork and security protocols for a decade and a half. It meant that somewhere in the labyrinth of classified programs and black operations, her father's story was still being written. The corridor they walked down was institutional but expensive, the kind of government construction that was built to last and to keep secrets. Offices and conference rooms branched off the main hallway, but the doors were closed and the nameplate slots were empty, giving the impression of a facility that was populated but anonymous. Agent Collins led her to a conference room that looked like thousands of other government conference rooms, except for the level of security measures that surrounded it. Sound dampening, electronic countermeasures, and communication systems that could reach anywhere in the world through channels that didn't officially exist. "Ma'am, if you'll have a seat, the briefing team will be with you shortly. Can I get you some coffee? Water? This conversation is probably going to take a while." The offer of refreshment was standard hospitality, but the warning about duration suggested that whatever they needed to discuss wouldn't fit into a simple question-and-answer session. They were preparing for the kind of briefing that involved PowerPoint presentations, classified documents, and decisions that would affect the rest of her military career. "Coffee would be great, Agent Collins, and thank you for treating this like a conversation instead of an interrogation. I get the feeling that could have gone either way." His smile was genuine, the expression of someone who appreciated cooperation in situations that could easily become adversarial. "Ma'am, we're all on the same team here. The circumstances are unusual, but we're hopping. This turns out to be the kind of conversation that solves problems instead of creating new ones." As he left to arrange for coffee, Vega was alone in the conference room with her thoughts and the growing realization that her life had just taken a turn into territory that she had never imagined existed. Somewhere in the desert outside Mercury Base, her A-10 was being examined by technicians who specialized in aircraft that carried capabilities beyond their official specifications. The ghost code that had started everything was still working its way through computer systems, opening files and triggering protocols that had been dormant since her father's supposed death 15 years ago. Each electronic handshake was revealing more pieces of a puzzle that someone had spent considerable effort to keep hidden. Through the conference room's small window, she could see aircraft that didn't appear in any civilian aviation magazines. Modified fighters, transport planes with unusual antenna arrays, and helicopters that looked like they belonged in science fiction movies rather than military inventories. Mercury Base was clearly home to operations that pushed the boundaries of publicly acknowledged technology. The door opened, and Agent Collins returned with coffee and what looked like the beginning of her new reality. A briefing team that included people from multiple agencies, carrying classified materials that would explain how her father's ghost code had found its way into her aircraft 15 years after his death. The lead briefer was a woman in her 50s, wearing civilian clothes but carrying herself with the authority of someone who had spent decades managing classified programs. She looked like the kind of person who could authorize operations that never appeared in official budgets and make decisions that affected national security without generating paperwork that could be subpoenaed by congressional committees. Tombstone, I'm Director Hayes from a department that doesn't have an official name, she began, the introduction carrying the kind of matter-of-fact directness that suggested she was accustomed to dealing with people who had stumbled into situations beyond their clearance level. We need to discuss your father, your aircraft, and why someone decided that today was the right day to wake up a program that's been dormant since 2010. Director Hayes opened a briefing folder that contained photographs, technical specifications, and documents that looked like they had been classified at the highest possible levels. The first photograph was of an A-10 Warthog that looked almost identical to the aircraft Vega had been flying, but with subtle differences in the antenna configurations and weapons pylons. This aircraft belonged to Major Marcus Reyes, callsign Tombstone, who was killed in action over Afghanistan on March 15, 2010, while providing close air support to a Marine unit that was under heavy fire from Taliban forces. The official record shows that his aircraft was destroyed by a surface-to-air missile, and his body was never recovered. The photograph hit her like a physical blow, not because she hadn't seen pictures of her father's aircraft before, but because she had never seen pictures of her father's aircraft that included the same modifications that had been installed on her own plane. The connection wasn't coincidental, it was intentional, designed by people who had been planning this revelation for 15 years. Director Hayes, she managed, her voice steady despite the emotional firestorm happening in her chest. Are you telling me that my aircraft is carrying the same systems that were installed on my father's plane? The director's expression was carefully neutral, the look of someone who was about to deliver information that would fundamentally change how the listener understood their own life. Tombstone, I'm telling you that your aircraft is carrying systems that were recovered from your father's wreckage and reverse engineered by people who weren't supposed to know they existed in the first place. Recovered from the wreckage. That meant someone had found her father's aircraft, had examined the classified systems it carried, and had spent 15 years developing technology that could replicate whatever capabilities those systems provided. It meant that her father's death had been the beginning of a story, not the end of one. The next photograph was of wreckage scattered across a mountainside, pieces of titanium and aluminum that had once been a combat aircraft, but now looked like abstract art created by high explosives and gravity. But even in the destruction, she could see evidence of technology that didn't belong on a standard A-10. Unusual antenna configurations, modified avionics bays, and electronic systems that were far more sophisticated than anything that should have been flying in 2010. The Taliban didn't shoot down your father's aircraft, Director Hayes continued, her voice carrying the weight of a secret that had been classified for 15 years. His plane was brought down by technology that shouldn't have existed, fired by people who shouldn't have had access to it, in support of operations that were never supposed to be discovered. Technology that shouldn't have existed. That suggested her father hadn't just been flying a close air support mission when he was killed. He had been testing or deploying capabilities that pushed the boundaries of what was publicly acknowledged to be possible. It meant that his death had been connected to programs that operated in the shadows between official military operations and completely deniable intelligence activities. Director Hayes, what kind of technology are we talking about, and who had access to it? The question opened a discussion that would span the next several hours and reveal the existence of programs that officially didn't exist, operations that were funded through budgets that couldn't be audited, and enemies who possessed capabilities that weren't supposed to be publicly acknowledged for another decade. But the most important revelation was still coming. The discovery that her father's death had been neither random nor complete, and that the ghost code she had been broadcasting was actually a message that had been 15 years in the making. Director Hayes turned to the next page in the briefing folder, revealing documents that showed her father's aircraft had been carrying experimental systems designed to identify and counter advanced surface-to-air missiles that were beginning to appear on battlefields around the world. The technology was classified at levels that required presidential authorization to discuss, and its existence was known to fewer than a dozen people in the entire government. Your father was part of a test program that was evaluating countermeasures for threats that our intelligence services believed would begin appearing in enemy hands within the next 5 to 10 years, she explained. The technology worked, but the enemy had countermeasures for our countermeasures. And that's when we realized we weren't just dealing with enhanced military capabilities. We were dealing with someone who had access to our development programs. Someone who had access to their development programs meant there was a security breach at the highest levels, a compromise that had allowed enemies to develop counters for technology that was still in the experimental phase. It meant that her father had been killed not just by superior firepower, but by superior information about what he was carrying and how to defeat it. The implications were staggering. There was a leak in the most classified military research programs. Someone was selling American defense secrets to people who used them to kill American pilots. And the whole situation had been covered up for 15 years to protect operations that were still ongoing. "Ma'am," Vega said carefully, "if this has been classified for 15 years, why are you telling me now? And what does it have to do with the ghost code that brought me here?" Director Hayes smiled, the expression carrying no warmth but considerable satisfaction, like someone who had been waiting 15 years to have this particular conversation. "Tombstone, we're telling you now because 15 minutes ago, your ghost code opened a digital lock that we've been trying to crack for 15 years. Your father didn't just die carrying experimental countermeasures. He died carrying information about who was selling our secrets to the enemy. The information was in her father's aircraft, encrypted in systems that required his specific biometric data and security codes to access. But those systems had been destroyed in the crash, leaving investigators with tantalizing evidence of a security breach, but no way to identify the source. Until someone had figured out how to replicate her father's identification codes and install them in an aircraft that carried his daughter. "The ghost code you've been broadcasting isn't just your father's transponder signal," Director Hayes continued. "It's a key that unlocks every piece of classified information that he gathered about the security breach, information that died with him 15 years ago, information that we need now more than ever, because the same people who killed your father are still selling American secrets to our enemies." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Vega had been turned into an unwitting courier, carrying information that could expose a 15-year-old conspiracy that was still active. Someone had spent considerable time and effort to get her father's codes into her aircraft, to get her into position to broadcast those codes, and to ensure that she would end up at Mercury Base where the codes could be properly utilized. The question was whether the person who had arranged all of this was trying to expose the conspiracy or protect it.